The Abyss, a novel by Hugo and Nebula Award-winning author Orson Scott Card, based on an original screenplay by James Cameron. Just the parts about the aliens. The Earth isn't much as planets go, but small as it is, most of human history has taken place in a space that's smaller yet, a thin layer starting in the dirt and sticking up maybe 12 feet into the air, about as high as a man on horseback can wave a sword. Now and then a building would punch a hole in that 12-foot ceiling. Now and then a miner's tunnel would drop down a little. But after a few years or decades or centuries, the people would abandon their works. Then the wind and rain would tear down whatever stuck up and fill in whatever went deep, until the earth was healed again. We could always see a little outside that layer, clouds rolling in, sunshine in the sky, stars at night. We could guess at what was going on under us when the earth shook, or when big old fish swam up and beached themselves to die. But the height of the heavens and the depths of the sea, they were so far away that whole civilizations could have been going on there and we'd never have known it. They were, and we didn't. There's no telling how long ago they first came to Earth. No human being was capable of noticing when they arrived. But that means only that they got here sometime before high-grade telescopes and radar. They don't even know how long ago they got here, or how long the voyage took, because they don't measure time except the way a little child does. This happened before that, and this other happened after. Why should they keep track of years and seasons? When you live 4 miles under the sea, there's no spring and fall, and even the tides are like a faint daily breeze, if you feel them at all. And why should they measure the passage of years? When you can't die, there's no reason to count how long you've lived. And yet, they do care about the past. Their name for themselves is builders of memory. They cling to everything that has happened to them since their first consciousness. That vast memory is their very self. They remember their arrival on Earth, and before that their arrival on each previous world, back to their planet of origin. If we had ever mattered to them, they would have remembered all of our history too. They might have noticed us if we had shared the same habitat, the way we take note of ant colonies and migratory birds. But our thin layer of the Earth's crust is as hostile to them as the moon is to us. Our atmosphere is only slightly thicker than the near vacuum of space. The only part of our planet they cared about was down so deep in the ocean that the water presses like the hands of cruel giants. Only there did they feel at home, and at that depth, the human race did not matter. Until we began to intrude. The sludge of our polluted rivers began to flow out onto the continental shelves and then seep down to the unfathomable depths, where they noticed the stink of it, the nasty taste. The fish began disappearing from the ocean, so that less and less of their detritus drifted down to where the builders were used to harvesting and using it. Torpedoes and mines made underwater explosions whose shock waves cracked the foundations of their spindly towers. At first, most of their communication is chemical. They thought these things were messages, and for some time they tried to decipher them. Then, when our pollution began to make them sick, to infest and infect them like a plague, when there was a famine of skeletal remains of fish and even microscopic plankton slackened, killed by radiation passing through the depleted ozone layer. Then they began to think that we, the creatures living in that thin layer between the sea and the sky, were enemies, trying to poison or starve them. Yet they were careful. We might even say they were patient with us, though that was not their motive. For a long time they merely avoided the places where our poisons flowed, while they watched us, to try to understand who we were and what we were doing. Even though nothing we sent into the sea was a message, they finally understood that the radio waves we emitted were messages, if only to each other. Since they had little language, at least as we understand it, it took years for them to decipher, sorting our messages by wavelength and then gradually discovering units of meaning. If the concept of language was hard for them, the idea that members of the same species would have different languages was almost unthinkable. Nations, famines, war, all within the same species. What kind of creatures were we? Like a family whose parents have died, like a cancer that devours the body that is its only source of life. The more they learned of us, the more alien we seemed, the more repulsive, insane, monstrous. Now they regretted the many centuries they had ignored us. Instead of devoting a relatively small part of their attention to studying us, they turned all their energies in our direction. How dangerous to the builders were we? How could they stop us if they needed to? They were not equipped for war. They had only developed the weapons needed to defend against dangerous but stupid predators. We, however, had developed weapons that could outwit and overpower enemies every bit as intelligent as we were, because our greatest danger always came from other humans. In order to learn the art of war, so they could eliminate the threat we posed to them, they had to study us. This was not work that could be done at the bottom of the sea. However, our radio and television signals never reached that level. Even the sun's light means nothing to them. They take their energy from vents in the Earth's crust, the breakdown of molecules, the temperature differential between layers of seawater. To comprehend us, they had to rise up out of the sea. They knew how to do it, of course. After all, they had crossed vast reaches of space to get here. And when their cities under the oceans of Earth reached maturity, they would build new starships and send out more colonies to other deep water worlds. That day was still far in the future, but in the meantime, their original starship still circled the Earth, out beyond the moon and perpetually behind it, where no land-bound telescope could see it. For the first time since the builders reached Earth, they released certain chemical codes among some of the porters, a related species that they had long ago domesticated. When young ones budded off the altered porters, they looked different. And when they grew, they did not take the shape of bottom-crawling haulers or the small, darting messengers that were most commonly used. Instead, they grew into gliders, able to hurtle through the sea at speeds we land-bound creatures can't even hope for, and then to rise up into the air, taking vast energy from every ambient source. Power enough to carry them over our cities and fields, over our sea lanes, through our flight paths as the builders inside each glider watched us, listened to us, and tried to understand what kind of creature we were. Our movements were meaningless to them. They could not imagine individual people choosing to live wherever they liked, so they could not understand why we wasted incredible amounts of energy in repetitive, unproductive travel. Even our buildings were incomprehensible. Since they lived in a place without weather, the notion of shelter did not come easily to them. Building a hollow structure just to contain something was strange enough. But when they realized that most buildings were mostly empty most of the time, they could only conclude that we were unimaginably stupid. Everything they built was completely full and completely used when it was no longer needed, even temporarily. It was broken down and the parts used for something else. Their contempt for us was complete. We never saw them watching us. Oh, maybe a glint of sunlight at just the right moment of the day reflected from a smooth, normally transparent surface. Maybe on a very dark, moonless night, the faint glow from inside a glider was visible as it soared overhead. A light in the sky moving at an unbelievable speed, then suddenly stopping, changing direction with no regard for the laws of motion. The gliders never came to rest on land, and since builders would die in seconds outside the hard-shelled gliders, no alien creature could possibly have emerged. Any such story you heard was, I was going to say, it was a lie, but how do I know? It might have been a hallucination. It might have been a dream. It might have been a hope, so hoped for that the mind believed it had come true. But it was not true. A builder could no more land and leave her glider than you could shed your skin and walk away. Almost transparent, filled to the shell with the cold, spicy liquid of life, they were near us, but we never really saw them. When we started sending up satellites, their work in understanding us leaped forwards. Out in space, they could finally touch something we have made, reaching inside the metal skin to explore. They found many of our open secrets there: electronic circuitry, the digital minds of computers, and the most ominous secret of all, nuclear power. To them it was brighter and more terrible than sunlight. Now they knew we were worse than a sewage-spewing race of stupid, wasteful land slugs befouling the edges of their home. We had the power to kill the world. Their world, too. The ocean. We were even more dangerous than they had feared. That's why on a certain morning at the peak of hurricane season, a glider fled from the satellite it was studying and flung itself earthward. The glider easily absorbed all the heat of re-entry, storing the energy in intricate structures inside itself, which could be used to speed its movement under the sea, or later to help build underwater towers, or to help another glider escape from gravity on a later outbound flight, almost invisible to the eye and completely invisible to radar. It glided southeastward over the Gulf of Mexico at 4 times the speed of sound, crossed the Horn of the Yucatan, and then plunged down into the Caribbean. So smoothly did it enter the water that there wasn't even a splash. The ocean simply opened up to receive it. Now in the dark sea, the bright energy stored during re-entry gave off a clearly visible glow, as the glider skimmed along not far under the surface. Even though it was underwater, technically the glider was not wet. Not a molecule of Caribbean water physically touched the surface of the glider. Instead, it flowed around the shell as if it were repelled by a magnet. There was almost no friction. The builders were better at moving through water than they were at moving through air. The glider seemed to be on a simple homebound flight. The oldest and greatest of all the builders' cities was here in the Caribbean, deep in the Cayman Trench, where almost no earth-born life could penetrate. The glider's course did not vary. It was heading home. But all these processes were carried on by the glider by reflex. Once the homeward course had been set, There was no further intelligent guidance. The builder inside was severely injured. The satellite she had been studying was launched into orbit only a few days before. It did what no other satellite had been able to do before. It tracked all submarines in the ocean. The exact location of every sub, in port or on maneuvers, on the surface or in its deepest dive, was detected and reported in coded messages to a series of Earth stations hour by hour. The existence of such a sub-tracker meant that for the first time in the age of missiles, a first strike could take out land and sea-based nuclear weapons. The surface of the Earth had just become a far more dangerous place. Individual builders are often granted a great deal of intelligence and good judgment, especially if they are required to be separated from their city for long periods, doing perilous, delicate work. So this builder understood that this new satellite was the most dangerous object in space, knew that if it were allowed to remain in working order even for a single hour, it could trigger the final terrible war. Either the nation that controlled it would use it to launch a preemptive strike, or the nations that didn't have it might find out about it and launch their own nuclear strike, fearing that if they didn't use their weapons, they'd lose them. There was no time of safety in which she could return home, transfer the information she had learned, and let the city come to a decision. Therefore, the builder made the decision herself. This satellite could not be allowed to continue to function. Carefully, she isolated her memories behind a shielded portion of the glider. Unfortunately, she could not shield her judgment and intelligence, since they were needed for the job at hand. Using the limbs and tools she had grown out of the belly of the glider, she reached into the shell of the satellite, searching for its burning nuclear heart. Her reflex was to absorb all its energy, but that would have killed her instantly. Instead, she channeled the energy flow into the satellite's most delicate computer parts. Only then did she release the power supply, rapidly, but not so rapidly as to cause a nuclear explosion. There was a burst of heat and light visible to every tracking station on that side of the Earth. More important to the builder, the power burst included a deadly amount of radiation. The intricate molecules that comprised her intelligence was scrambled beyond repair. Except for her carefully shielded memories, she was intellectually dead. That's why the glider's homeward course was so direct. Porters had intelligence comparable to that of a dog, enough to carry out simple tasks, fetch, stay, go home, but not enough to do any complex maneuvering. How could the builder foresee that there would be another encounter with a human artifact on the way home? It would require only a fraction of the intelligence and judgment that she had used to make her decision about the satellite, but she lacked even that fraction, and it was completely beyond the feeble intellect of the porter. So even as surface tracking stations were trying to make sense of the burst of light and heat that had just come from a recently launched spy satellite, another encounter between human and builder, this time even more direct and fatal, was about to take place. Number 2. Well, that was how the crew was, some of them anyway. And when the builders came to look at the sub, the glider, whose wake had destroyed the Montana, made it home almost as soon as the Montana stopped its descent on the ledge of the canyon wall. It took only moments for the city to realize that the builder inside was mostly dead. They found and swallowed her memories, and so learned about the new satellite and what she had meant to do about it. Then they tasted the glider's much more primitive memories to make sure the job had been carried out. They learned that it had. They also learned about the near collision with the Montana. The city was so near, the builders so quick that when they got to the Montana, there was still life, still memory locked in the brains of the near-frozen men. All were beyond reviving, but the builders wouldn't have tried to revive them anyway. To them, all that was necessary was to preserve the memories of the dead and build them into their city. They were doing for the crew of the Montana exactly what they would do for each other. The only difference was that they hardly knew how to begin trying to comprehend human memory. It was stored differently, organized strangely. They passed through the Montana like archaeologists trying to salvage strange new writings from a long-buried civilization, only they couldn't even be sure which artifacts were writing and which were garbage, so they took a record of everything, electrical and chemical patterns, and where each cell of each brain was in relation to all the others. Though 2,100 feet was quite shallow to them, as dangerous as it was for us to climb a 4-mile mountain without oxygen, they persisted. They worked with unimaginable speed. At the molecular level, they were as quick as blood, as quick as chemistry. Each builder would enfold the head of a newly dead man inside her own body, and then reach into the brain with microscopically small fluid tentacles, probing like slender fingers between and around and into the cells of the brain. Yet they did this delicate operation not with 1 or 2 or 5 fingers at a time, but with 10,000 fingers. They did it by reflex, no more noticing or planning the movement of each tendril than we notice the individual sensations carried by each neuron from our retinas. They got a perfect 3-dimensional image of the human brain at a molecular level as easily as we memorize a melody after hearing it only once. Long before they could suffer irreversible damage from the low pressure at the shallow depth of 2,100 feet, they had finished their work and dropped back down into the trench. Down to the depths where they were comfortable, back to the city in the sea. Not one builder was injured. Even if some had died, though, it would have been worth the attempt. They knew that if they gathered enough information, then perhaps they could decode it, compare it to the information they already collected, and eventually learn how to taste our memories the way they tasted each other's, pure and strong and clear. If they succeeded, they would know us better than we knew each other. They would see our lives from the inside out, see all that we had seen exactly as we saw it, and knowing us at last, they could then discover how to stop us from destroying the earth. Not for our sakes, for their own. If they could not stop us, they would be forced to abandon this world. And their life cycle on this world wasn't half complete. None of the cities were finished yet. They would be a failed colony, with nothing to do but return to their mother world empty-handed, in shame. It would be worse than death. They would send other builders to the Montana, of course, to study the structures of the submarine, the guidance and control systems, the torpedoes, the missiles, the warheads that could destroy the world, but this was secondary work. They had already discovered the principles of our machinery and electronics. The most vital information was the data collected by the first wave of builders, and included in that original data was the mind of a certain sonar man named Aaron Barnes, who wasn't really inside his body when he died, who was in fact alive in a house on Floyd Baker Boulevard in Gaffney, South Carolina, where a baby nursed and a woman smiled at him and said, "Good thing you come home, Ari, 'cause I was about to tell Junior his papa was Kareem. Good thing you come home, 'cause supper be almost ready and no way all of us can finish this mess. Mama's cooking without you, sucking down your share. You hear me?" Does that make any sense to you? Me telling you that Aaron Barnes wasn't really there? I tell you this. It made a hell of a lot of sense to the builders once they figured out how to understand the way our brains worked. A person's body being in one place while he thinks his real self is back home, where his best memories are kept. Why, that was the natural way of life to them. If all they'd found were minds full of thoughts of struggling to stay alive, or filled with despair and self-blame, like Captain Kretschmer's, if all they'd found were thoughts of here and now, then to them we would have been mere animals, nothing more. They would have dealt with us like animals. But they found Aaron Barnes, a man who had put himself in another place outside his own body. It wasn't all that clear to them. They couldn't watch our thoughts unfold like a movie or a book. They couldn't be sure of what they found. But Aaron Barnes, dead, gave them a glimmer that human beings might be alive in the sense that the builders themselves were alive. Barnes never knew it, but his being on that sub and dying there, thinking the way he did, it was just enough to give the builders hope that perhaps they could share this planet with us. So, as a builder came near to Jammer, by reflectively drawing from the ambient energy source, it shut down most of the electrical functions of his suit. It didn't drain his batteries, that was potential energy, not actual electrical flow, but it did siphon off whatever current the batteries were putting out. She knew, of course, that humans were fragile at this depth, and that the current they were using was probably important to their survival, so as quickly as possible she slackened her own energy demands, trying to leave the human as much as she could, enough that his lights still glowed dimly, enough that his air regulator continued to function, though sluggishly, not enough for their FOs to send signals strong and clear enough to be made into words on the other end of the thread. The builder hadn't gone to the Montana in order to meet with humans. As far as the builders knew, all the humans there were dead, their memories and bodies long since recorded. The city was working steadily, trying to decode human memory and comprehend the functions of the strange, fragile human body. Whatever they learned was immediately disseminated by direct memory transfer among all the builders in the city, and by messenger would soon be known in every city under the sea. So this builder, like any other, knew that as the danger from human beings became steadily more serious, it became more and more urgent to make some kind of contact with the living creatures, not just with their abandoned dead. She was working on the nuclear warheads in the Montana submarine, studying how they might be destroyed without being detonated, when she felt the warmth and movement and smells from human beings and their machines coming nearer, coming right into the sub. This might be important. She waited until 2 of them came directly into the same large chamber where she was working, waited until they separated, one remaining stationary, the other exploring further. Then she approached the stationary one, hoping to make contact, using what had been learned so far about the human body and mind. Because she was not riding in a porter or performing a particular specialized function, she appeared in her natural state, and because she was absorbing energy not only from Jammer's and Bud's batteries, but also from the nearby vehicles, she glowed brightly with the channels of energy flowing through her. The builder tried to communicate. It sent invisible tendrils out into the water, reaching until they found the man. Then they swarmed over his suit, probing until they found an opening large enough to get through. Surface tension kept the water from breaking through, but these intelligently guided tendrils weren't blocked. In moments, they were inside the man's helmet, inside his ears and nostrils. The builder sent molecular codes along the tendrils, which duplicated them inside the man's brain, reordering the electrical patterns enough to give him back some of the memories they had taken out of the dead men on the Montana. This seemed to get the man's attention. He was standing, frozen, staring at the builder as she came nearer and nearer, and she had no way of knowing that she was sending into Jammer's brain the point of death panic and despair that had filled a sailor's mind in the final moments of his life. In the meantime, she tried sending the messages that the decoders in the city had thought might work in speaking to humans. A message of good intentions, explaining how the builders would try to speak to them by introducing chemical messages into his brain. But all he seemed to do was breathe more shallow and rapidly, and then he opened his mouth and caused powerful, high-pitched vibrations inside the vessel that enclosed his head. She did not understand. Apparently it was impossible to communicate with these creatures, or perhaps she had done it badly. At least, she could salvage something from the botched attempt at contact. She made a rapid scan of Jammer's brain state, then quickly analyzed his body functions. This could be important, since Jammer was the first living human they had examined. At that moment, he turned and ran, and when he struggled to get free of a snag that caught at his pack harness, and finally when he broke loose and rammed his breathing regulator against the ceiling, she could tell at once that he was in a life-threatening condition, with bad air coming into the lungs, and it was all the worse because of his rapid, panicked breathing. Immediately she did what the city had suggested might have prolonged the lives of the men in the submarine. She introduced chemical changes in some of the molecules in his brain, causing him to drop immediately into a deep, relaxed sleep. It would last for several hours, causing much less stress on his body. Despite her best efforts, the human had obviously misinterpreted her actions and had tried to flee. No doubt others would do the same until a new contact strategy and perhaps a better contact vocabulary was developed. So the best thing she could do at the moment was leave the sub until the humans were gone. This one human would be all right until the others came to restore his equipment to proper functioning. She could already feel the new currents and taste the stronger flavor in the water, clear signals that one of them was approaching. She sank back down into the depths of the sub, then linked with her porter, and found her way out of the missile chamber. Lindsay had spent the whole time cruising the length of the Montana, taking close-up videos so that the full extent of the damage could be assessed. Her pictures would be essential, she knew, in order to plan an eventual raising of the hulk. Probably the Montana submarine would have to be raised in two sections, the nearly broken-off bow and the main part of the boat. Lindsay was nearing the bow when she heard some confusion over the speakers. Because she couldn't see what was happening, the voices made no sense. Somebody was in convulsions, bad stuff, but she didn't know what was going on, and so she couldn't take any useful action. She could hear Bud's voice among the others. "Bud, do you read? Bud?" But the only answer she got was from One Night in Flatbed. "Do you see the divers? Are they out yet?" Which meant that One Night didn't know any more than she did. Lindsay would have answered, but at that moment her lights went dim and her thrusters lost power. Cab 1 drifted in the water, no longer responding to her controls. She tried to check the fuses and throw switches, but nothing helped. And then she saw something through the dome window that made her forget everything else for a moment. A bright light was making a corona around the Montana sail. And then from the light there emerged something laced with light and moving unbelievably fast through the water right toward her. And then it was past her, before she could comprehend its structure or even its size. Now it was only a dazzling light with something hard and glassy at its core. Magenta and purple, colors so dim they usually couldn't be seen more than a few feet underwater. She was seeing light of that color, dozens, hundreds of yards away from its source. Whatever it was bright. Lindsay crammed her head into an awkward angle in the front bubble of Cab 1, trying to follow it with her eyes, but in a moment it was too far off. There was nothing to see. She knew that it wasn't made by any human hand, wasn't designed by any human mind. She had caught only a glimpse of it, but she knew there was no material, no structure, no engine, no light source ever conceived by the human mind that could do what this had done. Move so fast, drain Cab 1's power, and give off so much high-frequency light in the violet spectrum. This was something new, strange, impossible, yet she had seen it with her own eyes. As she strained to see it, Cab 1 bumped into the leading edge of the sail, and her momentum was enough to slam her around inside. Silt rose up from the seafloor, obscuring her view, and she could immediately check on hull integrity, buoyancy, make sure there was no damage. She knew that, but she couldn't take her eyes off the thing as it dropped away, down into the abyss.